He tied me to a chair and beat me until blood dripped onto the cold wooden floor. I was only 8. 10 years later, dressed in a white suit, I placed that bloody photo in front of him and asked, "Do you recognize this little girl?" He fell to his knees, clutching my leg, sobbing like a worthless man. I just stared, eyes cold as ice. I didn't need revenge. I only taught him what justice felt like. If you think this is just a normal family story, you're wrong. Hit subscribe now to watch more real-life, painful, and breathtaking episodes from us. The rain had been falling for hours, soaking the cracked sidewalks of Pine Grove Street, beating against the fogged windows of a small brown house that smelled faintly of old wood and stale coffee. In the living room, a single yellow lamp cast a cone of light onto a cheap pine table, illuminating the storm of papers scattered across its scratched surface. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, hair damp from the leaking gutter outside backpack slung loosely over her left shoulder. She was 17, her frame small but wiry from years of constant vigilance, eyes dark with questions she had long stopped asking out loud. Her breathing came short and shallow as she watched Steve pace back and forth across the threadbare carpet, jaw clenched so tightly a vein throbbed at his temple. Steve Whitman, her mother's second husband, the man who always smelled of whiskey after 8 p.m. and cologne before dawn. The man who could smile at a neighbor with impeccable charm but spit venom at a child the moment the door closed. His shoes were muddy, leaving prints across the beige carpet that Evelyn had vacuumed that morning before school. Her mother sat on the edge of the faded brown recliner, wringing the hem of her pale pink blouse so hard Evelyn wondered if it might rip. But she said nothing. Her gaze remained cast downwards, locked onto the carpet between her feet. $50,000. Steve hissed, his voice low and tight, almost too quiet for the room, making it more terrifying. $50,000 gone in one day. Evelyn shifted her weight, the wet hem of her jeans slapping against her ankle. The cold from outside clung to her skin, refusing to thaw. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again when Steve slammed his palm against the table, rattling a chipped ceramic mug filled with pens. "Don't you dare look away from me!" he snapped, pointing a trembling finger at her chest. "I ask you a question, and you stand there gawking like some idiot. Answer me." Her throat felt like it was closing in on itself. She swallowed, tasting metal. I don't know what you're talking about. I swear I don't." "Don't lie to me!" he shouted, sudden and explosive, making her flinch backward into the doorframe. The knob dug into her spine, grounding her in pain. "The bank called me today. That money was withdrawn from my business account at 10:32 a.m. And you?" He paused to jab the air between them with an accusing finger, his wedding band glinting under the lamplight. "You skipped third period today, didn't you?" She shook her head violently. No, I was in chemistry. Ask Mr. Hutchins. We had a lab test I couldn't have." "Stop lying," he roared again, his voice cracking with fury, or maybe something darker beneath it. He turned to the silent woman perched on the recliner. "Tell her to stop lying." Evelyn's mother flinched as if burned, but said nothing. Her pale blue eyes, the ones Evelyn inherited, flicked briefly to her daughter's face, then fell back to the carpet. She pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. Evelyn felt a scream building in her chest, but she didn't let it out. Screams never helped here. Screams only made him angrier. Steve's breathing was ragged now, the smell of mint gum barely masking the sour whiskey on his breath. He grabbed the nearest chair, yanked it forward, and pointed at it. "Sit." She obeyed, legs shaking. The backpack slid down her shoulder and thudded onto the floor. Her textbook spilled out, pre-calc biology AP literature, pages fluttering like dying birds across the linoleum. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers, so close she could see the broken capillaries webbed across his cheeks. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you're gonna get out of here with your scholarships and your little science trophies? Think you're better than me?" His words smelled rotten. Evelyn felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, hot and humiliating. "I didn't take your money," she whispered so quietly she almost wasn't sure she'd spoken. Steve's jaw twitched. Then, without warning, his open palm cracked across her cheek, snapping her head sideways so hard she tasted blood where her tooth cut into her lip. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears. For a moment the room spun into shapes and colors without meaning. Her mother gasped but still said nothing. Steve straightened, wiping his mouth as if disgusted by the scene he had created. "Get out," he said, his voice eerily calm now. The quiet before a hurricane. "Get your shit and get out of my house." Evelyn blinked rapidly, trying to steady her vision. The left side of her face throbbed with heat, pulsing with her rapid heartbeat. What? "Don't make me say it again," he growled. "You think you're grown fine. Go live like an adult. You're not my responsibility anymore." She looked desperately at her mother, silently begging for her to stand, to speak, to protect her. But her mother only sat there, shaking one hand, covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but no words coming out. Evelyn saw then that her mother's love was smaller than her fear, that her silence was the currency she paid to keep a roof over her head. Steve stepped back, gesturing wildly to the door. "Get out before I make you regret ever being born." Evelyn scrambled to the floor, hands fumbling to gather her textbooks, pens rolling under the table. The metal tang of blood coated her tongue. Her backpack felt impossibly heavy as she shoved everything inside with trembling fingers. Rain batted against the windows with rhythmic fury, as if it too wanted to come inside and scream. She zipped her bag, stood, and slung it over her aching shoulder. Her mother still didn't look at her. Steve folded his arms across his broad chest, his breathing slowing as the adrenaline left him, leaving behind only contempt. Evelyn wiped the blood from her chin with the back of her hand and walked slowly toward the front door. Each step felt like walking through wet cement. Her heart hammered so loud it drowned out everything but the quiet sobs coming from the recliner. She reached the door, fingers curling around the knob, and hesitated. One last time she turned back to them, to the woman who birthed her but would not save her, and to the man who had crushed her spirit so many times she had lost count. She opened her mouth to say something. "I love you, why please?" But no words came out. There was nothing left to say. She stepped outside into the storm. The rain swallowed her immediately, drenching her thin hoodie, clinging to her jeans, dripping down her neck in cold rivulets. She walked down the porch steps, boots sinking slightly into the soggy earth, and onto the cracked sidewalk illuminated only by the flickering street lamp above. Behind her the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through her chest like a final sentence handed down from a judge. Evelyn walked into the darkness, the cold gnawing at her bones, but she didn't look back. She didn't cry, not yet. Instead, she felt something ancient and primal stirring inside her chest. It burned hotter than the pain in her cheek, deeper than the ache in her heart. It was small and trembling now, but it was there. It was rage, and it would keep her warm tonight. The rain became a curtain between Evelyn and the rest of the world. It blurred the outlines of houses, smeared the glow of streetlights into trembling halos, and soaked her hair until strands clung to her cheeks like cold threads. She walked aimlessly down Maple Avenue, her sneakers squelching with each step, her backpack growing heavier as water seeped into the canvas. She pulled her phone out of her pocket with trembling fingers. The screen flickered under the raindrops, distorting her contacts list into glowing smudges of names and numbers. She scrolled down thumb, pausing over Kayla, lab partner. She hesitated. They weren't friends, not really. Kayla had shared her notes in chemistry and once offered Evelyn half a granola bar during lunch. But Evelyn had nowhere else to go. Her thumb hovered, then tapped call. It rang 4 times before Kayla's sleepy voice answered, muffled with annoyance. "Hello?" Evelyn's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely force words out. "Hey, it's Evelyn. I'm sorry to call so late. I need help. Just for tonight. Just somewhere dry to stay." Silence. Evelyn could hear the soft creak of Kayla's bed, the rustle of blankets. Then Kayla sighed. "My mom, she doesn't even let me have sleepovers. I'm sorry, I can't." "Oh." Evelyn blinked back tears as the rain sheeted down her face. Yeah, no worries. Sorry. Good night." She hung up before Kayla could reply, before she could hear the awkward sympathy in her voice. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled to the next name. Jason. Chem tutor. It rang once, twice, then clicked to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She tried 2 more numbers, classmates from AP Lit. Both went to voicemail. She didn't bother calling anyone else after that. Who would open their door for a dripping, shaking girl at midnight? Who would believe her if she said she had nowhere else to go? Who would care? She slipped her phone back into her pocket, feeling the battery heat against her thigh even as her body shivered. The rain soaked her to her skin. Every inch of her felt numb, raw, and exposed. She kept walking. Eventually, the small suburban houses gave way to the concrete sprawl of downtown. Neon signs flickered in Korean, Spanish, and English, casting colorful reflections onto the slick black pavement. A noodle shop was still open, steam clouding the glass window. She stood outside for a moment, watching a family eat together, the mother helping her little boy use chopsticks. A dull ache twisted in Evelyn's chest, sharper than the cold. She kept moving, crossing an intersection where the walk sign blinked frantically against the downpour. Cars roared past her, sending up waves of oily water that splashed across her jeans. She didn't flinch. By the time she reached St. Vincent's Medical Center, her fingers were so cold she couldn't feel them. She stood across the street, staring up at the 10-story building that loomed over her like a silent judge. The fluorescent lights on the emergency sign flickered against the black sky. She crossed the road, feet dragging, and stopped in front of the glass doors. Automatic sensors whooshed them open, releasing a blast of warm, antiseptic-scented air. She stood just inside, dripping onto the rubber mat, staring up at the lobby directory. Her reflection in the glass entrance stared back at her. A soaked, trembling girl with hair plastered to her scalp, blood still dried in the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were dark hollows, but deep within them something burned. A small, flickering flame that refused to die. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the hum of fluorescent lights vibrating through the walls. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed words she felt more than heard. One day she whispered, voice hoarse, raw from cold and tears. "One day I won't be kneeling anymore. One day you'll all see me standing." She stayed like that for a moment longer, forehead resting against the glass, feeling the warmth of the hospital lobby against her frozen skin. Then she turned and walked back out into the night. The next morning, Evelyn stood in front of the hospital's Human Resources office. Her clothes were stiff with dried rain. She hadn't slept. Instead, she'd hidden in the covered stairwell behind the emergency room, hugging her knees to her chest as the city woke around her. When dawn came, she combed her hair with her fingers and practiced smiling in the reflection of her phone screen. The HR director, a stern woman named Marcy, barely looked up when Evelyn entered. "Yes, I'm here about the job posting," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but steady. "Environmental services. Part-time. Marcy scanned her from head to toe. You 18? 17, but I'll be 18 in 3 months. Marcy frowned. We don't usually hire minors for overnight shifts. I can do day shifts. Or evening. Anything. Evelyn kept her gaze locked onto Marcy's face, refusing to look down at her soaked sneakers. Marcy sighed, flipping through a stack of papers on her desk. No criminal record. No. Any experience. Evelyn swallowed. I clean. At home. A lot. Marcy raised an eyebrow but handed her a form. Fill this out. If your references check out, I'll put you on a trial week. Training starts tomorrow. Bring a pair of black non-slip shoes. Her first shift started at 4 p.m. Evelyn changed into oversized navy scrubs and tied her hair into a tight bun. The locker room smelled of bleach and cold tile. When she emerged onto the service floor, her supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, handed her a mop and a plastic caddy of supplies. Stick to floors and bathrooms today, Rosa said without looking up from her checklist. After that, you'll shadow Pete in morgue sanitation. Evelyn nodded, gripping the mop handle so tightly her knuckles whitened. By 6 p.m., her arms burned from scrubbing bathroom tiles. The scent of industrial cleaner filled her lungs, mingling with the acrid tang of vomit and urine. She wore latex gloves 2 sizes too big, and they kept slipping down, letting bleach soak into her cracked knuckles. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she kept moving. At 7:30 p.m., a nurse with bleached blonde hair and glitter eyeliner breezed in heels, clicking against the damp floor. She paused when she saw Evelyn crouched by the toilet, scrubbing under the rim. Oh, she sneered. So you're the new little Cinderella. She smirked, pulling out her phone and snapping a photo before Evelyn could react. Don't worry, hon. Just sending it to the group chat. New staff orientation, you know. She laughed and left the scent of cheap floral perfume lingering behind her. Evelyn sat back on her heels, chest heaving. For a moment, tears welled in her eyes, blurring the grimy floor tiles. But she blinked them away, grabbed the toilet brush and scrubbed harder. At 9 p.m., Rosa handed her off to Pete, a silent man with thick forearms and a buzz cut. He led her down a narrow service corridor that smelled of ammonia and old metal. The morgue was colder than the rest of the hospital, a sterile chill that seeped into her bones. Pete handed her a mop and pointed at the rows of steel drawers lining the walls. Blood leaks sometimes, he said gruffly. Don't be squeamish. Evelyn nodded, gripping the mop handle so hard it bit into her palm. She began to clean, the rhythmic scrape of the mop against tile echoing in the stillness. Under the hum of fluorescent lights, surrounded by the silent dead, Evelyn felt something inside her crystallize. The pain, the humiliation, the loneliness. All of it coalesced into a singular, razor-sharp determination. Someday, she thought as she scrubbed dried blood from the floor. Someday I will rise from this place. Someday they will look up to see me standing above them, and they will remember what they did to me, and they will regret it. The clock on the hospital break room wall ticked past 6 a.m. Evelyn sat hunched over a sticky plastic table, navy scrubs wrinkled and damp with sweat from hours of mopping. Her fingers smelled of bleach and latex powder skin, cracked and red around her knuckles. She held a paperback biology textbook she'd found abandoned in the staff lounge's donation bin, flipping pages with trembling hands. Words blurred before her tired eyes. Sentences swimming into meaning she could almost grasp, but not quite. She mouthed them silently, tasting their unfamiliar syllables on her tongue. Neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, synaptic cleft. Most janitors don't spend their breaks reading neuroscience. Evelyn flinched so hard the book slipped from her fingers, smacking the table. She jerked her head up. An elderly man in a brown tweed blazer stood in the doorway, holding a paper cup of vending machine coffee. His white hair was cut short and neat combed back to reveal a lined forehead. Round tortoiseshell glasses perched low on his nose. His pale blue eyes were sharp bright, the eyes of someone who missed nothing. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, pushing back the chair with a screech. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll go clean the east wing now." He raised a veined hand, gesturing her back down. "Sit. Please. I didn't mean to startle you." Evelyn hesitated, then obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair like she might need to bolt at any second. Her fingers fumbled to retrieve the textbook, slipping it back into her lap, its pages now creased and damp with her sweat. The old man sipped his coffee, studying her with mild curiosity. "Do you understand what you're reading?" She swallowed. Her throat felt raw from lack of sleep and tears she hadn't let fall. "Some. Not all. I'm trying to learn. For later." Later he raised an eyebrow. She hesitated again, gaze flicking to the black name badge clipped to his breast pocket. Dr. William Hill, Neurology. The letters blurred before she forced herself to meet his eyes. "For when I'm not here. Cleaning toilets." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "And what is it you want to be when you're not cleaning toilets?" She gripped the edges of the textbook so hard her knuckles whitened. "A doctor," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might shatter the fragile hope inside her chest. Dr. Hill hummed, swirling his coffee thoughtfully. "That's quite an ambition." She said nothing. Her heart thundered so loud it drowned out the humming refrigerator, the flickering fluorescent bulb above their heads. He tilted his head, studying the bruising along her jawline where Steve's slap had bloomed purple overnight. His eyes flicked back to hers, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do you have your diploma?" She shook her head. "I'm working on my GED." He nodded once decisively, as if coming to an internal conclusion. "Come with me." Evelyn followed him down the polished white hallway, past the neurology ward, to a small research office tucked behind double glass doors. Inside it smelled faintly of old books, printer ink, and eucalyptus hand sanitizer. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with binders and medical journals. A framed Harvard diploma hung crookedly behind his cluttered desk. "Sit," he said again, gesturing to a battered office chair with peeling vinyl. He lowered himself into his leather chair with a small grunt, setting his coffee on a coaster that read, "Trust me, I'm a neurologist." He leaned forward, fingers steepled under his chin. "I've seen you here at all hours. Cleaning, restocking carts, hauling laundry bins, but never talking, never complaining, just watching, learning." She didn't know what to say. Her fingers twisted in her lap nails, biting into her skin. "I run a research study here," he continued. "Traumatic brain injury rehabilitation. It's grant-funded and chronically understaffed. We need data entry clerks and research assistants to compile patient outcomes and code neurocognitive tests. Usually I pull from med students or grad students, but..." He shrugged, eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "I could train a bright janitor, if she wanted the work." Her breath caught in her chest so sharp it hurt. You'd let me work here. I'd pay you minimum wage for data entry and chart management. You'd shadow my residents when they have time." And in exchange, he paused, fixing her with a steely gaze. "You study. You pass your GED within 6 months. Non-negotiable." She nodded so quickly her bun loosened, dark strands falling into her eyes. Yes, I can do that. I will do that." He smiled faintly. "Good. Training starts tomorrow, 5 a.m. sharp." And so it began. Montage. Evelyn in the empty hospital library at 2 a.m. Hoodie zipped up to her chin, scrawling algebra formulas onto scraps of receipt paper. Evelyn standing at a vending machine sipping black coffee from a cracked styrofoam cup, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but alight with determination. Evelyn at Dr. Hill's computer, painstakingly entering lines of patient data into SPSS spreadsheets. Her fingers hovering uncertainly before clicking enter with newfound confidence. Evelyn scrubbing toilets on her night shift earbuds and listening to English vocabulary flashcards whispered by an online app. Photosynthesis, neurotransmission, myelin sheath. Evelyn in the GED test center, sitting among ex-cons and teen dropouts, clutching her number 2 pencil so tightly her nails left half-moons in her palm. Evelyn running across campus in the pre-dawn darkness, binder pressed to her chest, eyes bright with tears that streamed down her cheeks from the biting wind and from something deeper, sharper that felt almost like hope. 6 months passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. She slept in a cot in the hospital storage room between shifts, showered with industrial hand soap in the janitor closet sink, and memorized entire chapters of biology and literature while mopping the pediatric oncology wing. Every day she sat beside Dr. Hill, typing patient progress notes into the EMR system, while he dictated, absorbing each word like oxygen. Evelyn, he said one morning without looking up from his tablet, defined diffuse axonal injury, widespread lesions in white matter tracts due to traumatic shearing forces from rapid acceleration or deceleration. She recited automatically, barely pausing in her typing. He nodded with a small smile. And prognosis. Generally poor with persistent vegetative state if severe, but mild cases can recover cognitive function with neuroplasticity interventions within 6 to 12 months. His smile widened. You're wasted on janitorial work, Evelyn. But Evelyn only shook her head, eyes locked onto the screen, fingers flying over the keys. Not for long, she whispered so quietly only she could hear it. 2 weeks later, her GED results arrived in a thin white envelope creased from where it had been stuffed into her cubby by an indifferent mail clerk. She opened it with trembling hands, heart pounding so loud she thought she might vomit. Pass. She sank down onto the linoleum floor, tears spilling down her cheeks, soaking the paper until the ink bled. She pressed the letter to her chest, curling into herself with silent sobs that racked her thin shoulders. Outside, the sun rose over the city, casting long golden beams through the dusty hospital windows. Evelyn sat in that light, clutching her future to her chest, letting the warmth soak into her cold skin. For the first time in years, she felt the small, silent certainty bloom inside her like a hidden garden finally seeing dawn. She was coming for everything they said she could never have, and no one would stop her. The acceptance letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was tucked between overdue electric bills and discount grocery flyers in her small mailbox behind the hospital loading dock. She almost missed it, the crisp cream envelope blending into the sea of gray and white notices. Only the embossed crimson crest of Harvard Medical School in the corner caught her eye. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. The paper felt thick and expensive against her cracked skin. She turned it over twice before tearing it open, careful not to rip the letter inside. Her eyes skimmed the lines in desperate panic, searching for the one word she needed. There it was. Congratulations. She didn't even feel her knees buckle, but suddenly she was on the concrete floor, gravel biting into her skin through thin scrubs. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt and dust below. Her chest heaved with dry, broken sobs. She pressed the letter to her heart, crumpling its perfect folds with her shaking fingers. For a moment, the world fell away. There was no bleach, no morgue, no Steve, no mother's vacant eyes. Just her and this paper. Proof that her pain had not been in vain, that her nights scrubbing urine off floors while memorizing pharmacology terms had led her somewhere far from here. Later that night, Evelyn sat cross-legged on her cot in the janitor supply closet she called home, the acceptance letter laid out before her like an altar offering. The flickering fluorescent bulb above buzzed softly, illuminating the outlines of her small kingdom. Mop buckets, bleach jugs, folded rags. She traced each letterhead word with a trembling fingertip. Full merit-based scholarship, 4-year MD program, housing included. A sob rose in her throat, but she swallowed it back. She couldn't afford tears tonight. Instead, she grabbed a lined notebook from her backpack and opened it to a fresh page. At the top, in small, neat handwriting, she wrote, "Harvard, what I need before I leave." Below it, she made a list. Return scrubs to Rosa. Resign cleaning shift. Finalize Dr. Hill's data reports. Buy a black blazer for orientation. Get on that plane. She stared at the last line for a long time, pen hovering over the paper. Her chest ached with something so sharp it felt like grief, though she couldn't say what she was mourning. Finally, she pressed her lips together, clicked the pen closed and slipped it behind her ear. She lay down on her cot, the crinkle of the acceptance letter beneath her pillow, a comforting rustle in the silence. Above her, the cracked ceiling tiles glowed under the flickering bulb, casting broken shadows across her tired face. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of tomorrow. The airport smelled of burnt coffee and lemon floor polish. Evelyn sat alone in Terminal B, boarding pass clutched in her sweating hand. Her knees bounced with restless energy as gate agents called names she didn't hear, their voices echoing through the cavernous terminal like radio static. She wore a crisp white button-down shirt and black trousers she had bought at Goodwill 2 days before, still a size too big, despite her attempts to cinch them at the waist with an old shoelace hidden beneath her belt. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, making her cheekbones stand out starkly above the purple bruise that had finally faded along her jawline. Her backpack, scuffed and fraying, rested at her feet. Inside were 2 textbooks, a change of clothes, her old biology notes, and the acceptance letter, now laminated at Staples so it would never tear. She carried nothing else. Everything she owned that mattered was in her mind and her blood. "Now boarding Group 4 for Boston Logan International," the agent announced over the intercom. Evelyn stood, slipping the backpack over her shoulder. Her legs felt wooden, her chest tight with anticipation and terror in equal measure. She joined the line of weary travelers, businessmen with rolling suitcases, a young mother rocking a fussy toddler, an old man clutching a straw hat. When it was her turn, the agent scanned her boarding pass with a mechanical beep and handed it back without looking up. Evelyn stepped forward down the jet bridge into the humming belly of the plane that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. She settled into seat 22A, pressing her forehead to the oval window streaked with rain. Outside, the runway lights glowed in blurred orbs of orange and white. Raindrops collected and slid down the glass like racing tears. As passengers boarded around her, stuffing bags into overhead bins and jostling for space, Evelyn closed her eyes. She forced herself to breathe deeply, counting each inhale and exhale like Dr. Hill had taught her before important presentations. 1, 2, 3, 4. When she opened her eyes again, the plane was pushing back from the gate. The engines roared to life beneath her feet, a vibration that thrummed through her bones and teeth. She pressed her palm against the window, watching as the terminal receded, the rain falling harder, now blurring everything into streaks of gold and gray. The plane taxied to the runway, pausing as another aircraft soared overhead, its lights blinking like a beacon in the black sky. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. Her throat burned with words she had never spoken aloud. In her mind, she saw Steve's face twisted with contempt, her mother's downcast eyes refusing to meet her gaze, Daniel's cruel grin as he spat at her shoes, the cracked linoleum floor of the house that never felt like home. A bitter, almost feral smile curled her lips. "Goodbye," she thought, her fingers curling into a fist against the cold window. "I will never come back to this place, unless it's to end what you started." As the plane surged forward, engines screaming, she felt the weight of the ground fall away beneath her. The city lights spread out below in a vast, glittering tapestry so beautiful from above, it almost looked holy. She watched them shrink, each tiny glowing dot, a memory, a wound, a scar, until finally they disappeared into the darkness. She rested her head against the window, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. But these tears were not from sorrow or fear. They were from something older, deeper, something forged in blood and bone and sharpened by every humiliation she had ever swallowed. Resolve! She closed her eyes as the plane leveled out high above the storm clouds, her body pressed against the thin seat cushion, her heart thundering with grim certainty. One day I will return, not as a beggar, not as a daughter, but as the reckoning you never saw coming. And as the flight attendants began to roll the drink carts down the aisle, Evelyn exhaled into the humming silence of the plane cabin. For the first time in her life, she felt the faintest flicker of peace, because finally she was leaving, and she would never kneel again. Harvard smelled different than any place Evelyn had ever been. It smelled like old books and new ambition, like cedar floors polished to gleaming perfection, like espresso brewed in sleek silver machines by baristas who wore cashmere scarves instead of aprons. The lecture halls smelled faintly of chalk dust and leather, and the library smelled like quiet triumph. The first week nearly broke her. Her classmates swept into classrooms in tailored coats and wool trousers, sleek ponytails swinging Rolexes glinting under fluorescent lights. They spoke in clipped, confident tones about sabbaticals spent volunteering in Ghana, about research internships under Nobel laureates, about ski trips to Aspen during winter break. Evelyn sat in the back corner, shoulders hunched over her thrifted parka, biting the frayed edge of her pen cap. Her textbooks were rentals from the financial aid office covered in clear plastic sleeves with peeling barcode labels. Her laptop wheezed every time she opened a new tab, the fan roaring like a dying engine. No one sat next to her. On the third day of cellular metabolism, Professor Sanders handed back their diagnostic quizzes. Evelyn flipped hers over and felt her chest tighten 68. Red pen circled the number 3 times as if to brand her publicly. She scanned the rows of students in front of her. 2 girls with matching Tory Burch flats giggled softly, sliding their quizzes to each other. Evelyn caught a glimpse, 98-94. Her cheeks burned with shame so intense she wanted to sink into the floor. She spent that night in the library basement, a fluorescent-lit dungeon lined with silent study carols. Her stomach growled painfully, but she ignored it, highlighting each line of Leninger Principles of Biochemistry, until her vision blurred. At 3 a.m., she staggered out into the freezing October air, tears freezing on her cheeks as she crossed the quad to her dorm. A week later, she met Minji. It happened in lab. She was fumbling with the micropipette, her gloved fingers trembling with exhaustion. She'd been up all night finishing a pharmacology problem set and memorizing amino acid structures for her upcoming quiz. The pipette tip clattered onto the stainless steel counter. Before she could grab a new one, a hand appeared in her vision, offering her a fresh, sterile tip. She looked up. He was short and wiry, with hair dyed ash gray and dark roots just starting to peek through. A small gold cross dangled from his left earlobe. His lab coat sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms dusted with chalk from climbing, the signature mark of the Korean grad students who spent evenings at the Boston Bouldering Project. His name tag read, Min J. Park, Ph.D. candidate neurobiology. "You're in Dr. Collins's group, right?" He asked, his voice light with a Seoul accent softened by years in the States. "First year MD," she nodded, ducking her head. "Yeah, sorry. I'll be quick," he shrugged. "No rush. I'm done with my assay. Need a hand." She hesitated. Her pride roared in protest, but her body, trembling with fatigue and hunger, surrendered. If you have time," He smiled a quiet upward curve of his lips. Always time to keep samples from getting contaminated. He gestured for her to move aside deftly, recalibrating the pipette, explaining each step in slow, patient English. His hands moved confidently, the movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His voice was calm, almost meditative, as he narrated the procedure. Something about his presence calmed her racing heart. After that, he found excuses to sit next to her in lab, correcting her pipetting technique, helping her label her samples in neat Korean handwriting when her fingers shook too much to be legible. They began eating lunch together in the crowded medical school cafeteria, he, with his stacked lunchboxes of rice kimchi and sesame spinach, she with her granola bar and instant coffee. "You need to eat more than that," he scolded one afternoon, pushing half his rice bowl across the table. "Your hands are trembling." She shook her head stubbornly. "It's fine." He cocked an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Protein is brain fuel. Eat." She took the bowl with trembling hands, too hungry to argue. They started studying together in the library. Min-jae's notes were works of art, color-coded mind maps that sprawled across entire pages in delicate looping Hangul and tiny English letters. He quizzed her relentlessly, tapping his pencil against her temple when she hesitated. Glycolysis, rate-limiting enzyme. Phosphofructokinase. Good. Pentose phosphate pathway. Key product, NADPH and ribose 5-phosphate. Better. They fell into an easy rhythm. Her marks climbed from 68 to 88 to 96 in 3 weeks. Professor Sanders called her into his office to ask if she'd hired a tutor. She smiled small and secret. Something like that. One night in late November, they sat in a silent study room overlooking Harvard Yard, the windows fogged from their breath. Snow fell in soft spirals outside, blanketing the campus in hushed white. Evelyn sat curled on the window ledge, knees tucked to her chest, textbook balanced on her thighs. Min-jae closed his laptop, rubbing his eyes. "Take a break," he murmured, pushing a thermos of barley tea toward her. "You'll burn out." She shook her head. "Can't afford to." He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. In the dim lamplight, her eyes looked almost black, ringed with violet shadows. Her cheekbones jutted sharply above hollowed cheeks. "Why are you here, Evelyn?" he asked softly. "Why medicine? Why this punishment?" She closed her eyes, feeling the words burn in her throat. For a long time she said nothing. The clock on the wall ticked away their silence. Finally she whispered, "I had to get out." "Out of where?" She stared at her trembling hands. "Home." Her voice cracked on the word. He said I was worthless, that I'd never be anything but trash." Min-jae's jaw tightened. "Your father?" She shook her head slowly, eyes still closed. Not my father. My stepfather. He hated me. Her voice broke a sob, slipping through before she could swallow it down. She pressed her palm hard against her lips, forcing the sound back into her chest. Min-jae stood and crossed the room. Gently he pried her hand away from her mouth and held it in his own. His palm was warm, his grip strong and steady. "He doesn't get to define you," he said softly, his voice vibrating with quiet conviction. "You hear me? You are not what he called you. You are what you build with your own hands." She let out a trembling exhale, her shoulders shaking as silent tears fell onto his wrist. For a moment, they stayed like that, 2 shadows in a dim room, the falling snow outside tracing soft white lines down the darkened glass. That night, as she walked back to her dorm through the snow-choked streets, Evelyn tilted her face to the sky, letting the cold flakes melt against her flushed cheeks. Each step felt lighter, like some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She still carried the past with her, Every slap, every insult, every night spent scrubbing blood off linoleum floors. But now it felt different. Less like chains, more like armor. She clenched her fists inside her coat pockets, feeling the bones of her knuckles press against the worn fabric. One day she promised herself, staring up at the dark sky streaked with snow, "One day I will return, and you will know who I've become." The email arrived at 2:14 a.m., buried under newsletters she never read and spam from student loan agencies. She was hunched over her laptop in the basement lab, eyes glazed from staring at fluorescence microscopy images for hours, when the notification pinged. Subject line: condolences. At first, her sleep-deprived brain didn't process it. She clicked it open absently, expecting a departmental announcement about a faculty death. Instead, a single line burned against the white screen. "Your mother passed away yesterday. Funeral is Friday at St. Luke's. Steve." She reread it 3 times. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as an invisible fist closed around her ribcage. The letters blurred into watery black stains. She pressed the heel of her palm hard against her sternum, trying to force air back into her lungs. "No, I'm sorry. No. She asked for you. Just an announcement. Cold, final, like a bill due." She didn't realize she was shaking until Min-jae appeared beside her, gently closing her laptop. "Hey." His voice was quiet, careful, like someone speaking to a wounded animal. "Come on. You need sleep." But Evelyn shook her head, pushing his hand away. "I have to go. I have to." Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, tasting iron. "I have to see her." 3 days later, Evelyn stood outside St. Luke's Lutheran Church in her only black dress, a plain thrift store shift that clung to her thin frame, the hem brushing the tops of scuffed black flats. The sky above was a pale, indifferent gray. The wind bit at her bare arms as she gripped her small purse with both hands to keep them from trembling. A row of sleek black cars lined the curb engines, idling, sending up thin curls of exhaust into the cold morning air. She could see them through the stained glass windows. Steve in a dark tailored suit, Daniel at his side, taller and broader, now his hair slicked back with expensive gel. Her stomach twisted. She forced herself to inhale slowly, holding the cold air in her lungs until it burned, then exhaling through parted lips. "You're not here for them," she reminded herself. "You're here for her." She climbed the stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The smell hit her immediately. Roses, beeswax candles, and something else, the sterile sweetness of funeral home formaldehyde. It coiled in her chest like sickness. Rows of mourners in muted coats and pearls sat with solemn faces, as the pastor droned on about beloved mother, devoted wife, woman of grace. Evelyn stood at the back, gripping the edge of a pew so hard her knuckles ached. Steve turned slightly, his gaze catching hers over the sea of bowed heads. His eyes narrowed with cold calculation. He turned back to the pastor without acknowledging her. When the service ended, people rose in quiet rustles of wool and silk. Evelyn weaved through them, heart thundering with desperation. She reached the front just as they began to close the casket. "Wait!" she gasped, voice trembling. "Please, just let me see her. One last time." Steve stepped forward, blocking her path. Up close, his cologne burned her nostrils, bitter, heavy, suffocating. His mouth curled into a small, contemptuous smile. "She didn't ask for you," he said softly, so no one else could hear. "She died without your name on her lips. You lost that right the day you walked out." Evelyn's chest convulsed with silent sobs. She forced back down her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face into a cruel smear of flesh and shadow. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I just need to see her." Steve leaned closer, his hot breath brushing her cheek. "Get out. Now, or I'll have you removed." She staggered back as the pallbearers closed the casket lid with a muted thud that reverberated through her bones. The sound ripped something open inside her chest. She stumbled down the aisle, vision swimming with unshed tears. Her knees threatened to buckle with each step. As she reached the back of the church, a voice called out, "Well, well, look who decided to crawl back." She froze. Daniel stood leaning against the coat rack, arms folded across his broad chest. Dark suit tailored perfectly to his thick frame. He smirked as she turned to face him, his eyes sweeping over her thrifted dress with open disgust. "Didn't think the rat would show up for the funeral," he sneered. "What's wrong? Couldn't scam enough patients at your charity clinic to buy real clothes for the occasion?" Evelyn said nothing. She pressed her lips together so hard they turned white. Daniel chuckled low and dark. "What no comeback today? Cat got your tongue rat." She moved to step past him, but he blocked her with his arm. His smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth. "Hey," he said softly, leaning down until his lips brushed her ear. "You're nothing, you know that. Nothing but street trash. That's all you ever were." Then he spat. The glob of warm saliva landed on the toe of her left shoe, sliding down the worn leather until it pooled against the scuffed sole. The world narrowed to a single ringing silence. Evelyn stared down at it, bile rising in her throat. Slowly she raised her gaze to meet his. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but her face was carved from stone. Daniel tilted his head, smirking triumphantly. "What? No tears today, rat girl." She said nothing. Her jaw clenched so tightly pain radiated down her neck. Blood filled her mouth where her molars cut into the inside of her cheek. The metallic taste grounded her, kept her from crumbling. Without a word, she stepped around him, wiping her shoe against the edge of the carpet as she passed. Each step echoed loudly against the polished church floor. Outside, the wind whipped her hair into her eyes, cold enough to sting, but she welcomed it. She walked down the stone steps and into the gray morning without looking back. At the bottom of the stairs she paused. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms until she felt the wet warmth of blood. She raised her chin, staring out at the silent street lined with skeletal winter trees. Her breath came in ragged puffs, each exhale mingling with the frosty air before dissolving into nothing. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she pressed her bleeding tongue against her teeth, tasting iron and resolve. The pain reminded her she was still here, still fighting, still alive. One day she promised herself, staring at the distant horizon, where the gray sky met the dead earth. "One day you will know what I've become." And with that she turned and walked away, leaving behind the church, the casket, and the last vestiges of the girl who once begged them to love her. The sun rose over Cambridge in pale strokes of gold, and rose brushing the brick walls of Harvard Medical School with gentle warmth. Inside, Evelyn stood before her locker, the metal door plastered with taped-up note cards scribbled with pathways, equations, and last-minute mnemonics. Her reflection in the small, scratched mirror stared back hollow cheeks, dark crescents beneath her eyes, but something fierce and unbreakable blazing within them. 4 years. 4 years of never sleeping more than 4 hours a night, of chugging bitter hospital coffee to stay awake during rounds of swallowing humiliation from attendings who called her questions quaint and classmates who ignored her unless they needed her notes. 4 years of never letting a single tear slip until her dorm room door clicked shut behind her. And now it was done. She tied her long black hair into a low bun and slipped into her white coat one last time, fingers trembling as they smoothed down the front. The embroidered words Evelyn Carter, M.D. gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She pressed her palm against them, feeling the vibration of her heart beneath her ribs. Then she closed her locker door and walked out into the early morning light, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway with quiet finality. 1 month later, Evelyn stood beside Min-jae under the humming fluorescence of a cramped retail storefront on the edge of Chinatown. The for rent sign still hung crooked in the dusty window, half obscured by streaks of soot from passing buses. The air smelled of old sesame oil and bleach from the abandoned nail salon next door. "This is it?" Min-jae asked, arching a brow. His hair had grown out sweeping across his forehead in tousled silver strands, and he wore a plain gray sweatshirt stained with paint samples. Evelyn didn't answer. She ran her fingertips along the peeling wallpaper, feeling the grit catch beneath her nails. She could already see it: clean white walls, rows of blood pressure cuffs, and EKG machines' exam tables covered in crisp butcher paper. Patients lined up out the door, greeted not with condescension, but with dignity. She turned to him, eyes bright with conviction. "This is it." He smiled slowly, the corners of his lips tilting upward with quiet amusement. "Then let's get to work." They spent weeks scrubbing nicotine stains from ceiling tiles, ripping up cracked linoleum to reveal warped plywood beneath. Evelyn slept on the floor at night, curled under an old flannel blanket, the sawdust and adhesive fumes clinging to her hair. Min-jae cooked ramen on a single electric burner perched atop an overturned milk crate. Between paint coats and drywall patches, they hunched over Evelyn's laptop, drafting grant applications to community health programs and hospital seed funds. The day they finally hung the sign above the front door, Phoenix Cardio Care Clinic, Evelyn stood across the street, staring up at the bold black letters against crisp white acrylic. Her chest tightened an ache so deep it almost felt like grief. "Phoenix?" Min-jae asked, stepping up beside her with 2 steaming paper cups of black coffee. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" She took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth coat her tongue before swallowing. The wind tugged strands of hair loose from her bun, whipping them across her cheeks. Her eyes never left the sign. "I was ashes," she said softly. "Now I'm not." He said nothing, just reached out and rested his gloved hand against her arm, squeezing gently. The clinic's first patient was a thin Cambodian grandmother with end-stage heart failure. Her ankles swollen with fluid retention, her eyes dull with resignation. Her son wheeled her in, clutching a crumpled advertisement Evelyn had printed at the campus library, offering free cardiac screening for uninsured patients. Evelyn knelt beside her, taking her icy hand in her warm, calloused one. Their eyes met. 2 women separated by decades and language but bound by the same silent dignity. "It's okay," Evelyn murmured in soft, halting Khmer words she had learned late at night listening to language tapes. "You're safe here." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She nodded once, clutching Evelyn's hand tighter. 3 months later, their patient roster had grown from a trickle to a steady stream. Working-class immigrants, undocumented workers, elderly widows, all came through the glass doors seeking blood pressure checks, arrhythmia consults, cholesterol screenings. Many arrived afraid, bracing for judgment. All left with a plan and the quiet dignity of being seen. It wasn't enough. Late one night, Evelyn sat at her desk, scrolling through lab equipment catalogs under the dim glow of a single desk lamp. Her elbow rested in a cold puddle of spilled coffee long since soaked into her research notes. Her eyes burned from staring at her laptop screen for hours, but she couldn't look away. The stats glared back at her hypertensive crisis readmissions in Boston's Chinatown, up 18% in the last year. Most patients didn't check blood pressure at home either, unable to afford the cuffs or too scared to use them without training. Every time they collapsed in their kitchen or on the bus, it was a preventable tragedy. She pressed her thumb and forefinger against her eyes, breathing out a long, shaking sigh. There had to be a better way. Min-jae found her an hour later, asleep at her desk, chin resting on a page scrawled with schematics in black ink. He squinted down at the design. a simple wrist cuff sensor connected to a low-cost transmitter module Bluetooth-enabled to send blood pressure readings directly to clinic records via a patient's prepaid phone. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Brilliant idiot," he murmured, draping his jacket over her shoulders before switching off the lamp. 6 months later, Evelyn stood before a boardroom of venture capitalists, their Armani suits gleaming under recessed LED lighting, their Rolexes flashing as they tapped their pens against smooth lacquered tables. Behind her, projected onto a massive screen, glowed the final design of her device, PulseLink, remote cardiac monitoring for the underserved. She inhaled deeply, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs like a war drum. The room smelled faintly of citrus polish and entitlement. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her voice didn't shake as she began. Hypertension is the silent killer. It does not discriminate, but healthcare access does. PulseLink bridges that gap for patients who've been ignored too long. Slide after slide, she walked them through her pilot data. The dramatic 40% drop in ER readmissions among trial patients, the seamless EHR integration, the manufacturing cost breakdown. Her mind burned with purpose, her words crisp and surgical. When she finished, the room fell silent. A heavy-set man with a thick gold watch cleared his throat. "You were a med student, Dr. Carter." She met his gaze, evenly, chin lifting a fraction. "I was. And I scrubbed hospital toilets to get there." A long pause. Then he smiled, slowly nodding. "You've got grit." 2 hours later, Evelyn stepped out of the glass skyscraper and onto the sunlit street below. Her phone buzzed in her pocket with an email notification. She pulled it out, reading the subject line through the glare of the afternoon light. Funding approved. 2.5 M Series A. PulseLink. The sidewalk swayed beneath her feet. For a moment her knees threatened to buckle. Then the moment passed, leaving only a fierce, quiet triumph in its wake. She lifted her face to the sun, eyes closed as its golden warmth kissed her skin. The city roared around her. Car horns, subway rumble, snatches of Mandarin Spanish Khmer drifting on the breeze. But it all felt distant, muted by the thundering beat of her own pulse. She stood there in her tailored white blazer, the hem rippling around her knees in the gentle wind. The name Dr. Evelyn Carter engraved on her business card in her pocket. Her eyes opened dark and clear, reflecting the glass towers that now bore her name on their contracts. Her lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. This is only the beginning, and with that, she stepped forward into the waiting future, leaving shadows behind her to burn in the sun. The morning air in Boston had turned sharp and crystalline, biting against Evelyn's cheeks as she stepped out of her town car and into the Circle Drive of Haven General. The hospital's sleek glass facade rose above her, each floor glowing softly under the pale dawn sky. Workers in neon vests hurried to set up a stage in front of the main entrance, weaving between camera crews adjusting tripods and reporters sipping coffee from paper cups. She paused at the curb, lifting her gaze to the towering building. The enormous vinyl banner draped across its front rippled in the breeze. Grand opening, Haven General by E.M. Carter Health. Her chest tightened as she read her name, or rather the name she chose to show the world. E.M. Carter. Evelyn Marie Carter. Her middle name and her mother's maiden name. No Whitmore. No reminder of the bloodline that tried to drown her before she learned how to swim. A gust of wind whipped her black wool coat around her calves, making the silk lining flutter against her skin like phantom fingers. She tucked her hair behind her ear, squaring her shoulders before walking forward. The ceremony felt surreal. The mayor spoke first, droning on about job creation and community outreach. Then the state health commissioner praised Dr. Carter's innovation in remote cardiac monitoring and her relentless commitment to equitable care models. Evelyn stood behind the podium, expression, composed hands clasped lightly in front of her, while photographers crowded the stage, snapping shots of Boston's newest medical mogul. She barely heard them. Her mind buzzed with checklists, staffing logistics, vendor contract negotiations, the upcoming pitch to expand PulseLink to Veterans Affairs hospitals nationwide. Her eyes flicked to the crowd scanning the rows of suited executives, city officials, and board members. She spotted Min-jae near the back wearing a navy peacoat over his scrubs hair tousled from a long night shift. Their eyes met briefly. He gave her a small, tired smile and nodded once. Her chest loosened slightly. When the commissioner finally stepped aside, gesturing for her to approach the podium, Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling her pulse steady in her throat. She moved forward, the crowd erupting in polite applause. The microphones buzzed as she adjusted them to her height. She rested her palms on the sides of the podium, letting her gaze sweep across the sea of faces. Her eyes burned under the harsh morning light reflecting off the steel and glass, but she didn't blink. "Thank you," she began, her voice low but clear, carrying easily through the amplifiers. "When I was 17, I stood outside a hospital just like this one. I remember thinking how big it was, how clean it looked, how impossible it felt to ever walk through those doors as anything but a burden." She paused, letting the words settle. In the front row, a young nurse shifted uncomfortably, tears pooling in her wide brown eyes. "I promised myself that day," Evelyn continued, her tone gaining strength. "If I ever had the chance to change that for someone else, I would." She drew in a measured breath. The wind lifted strands of her hair, casting shifting shadows across her sharp cheekbones. "Today, with the opening of Haven General, our 12th facility this year, we take another step towards a future where quality care is not a privilege but a right." The applause rose like a wave, crashing around her in a blur of claps and cheers. But Evelyn barely heard it. She stared past the cameras, past the lights, past the curated backdrop of blue and silver balloons. In her mind, she saw a 17-year-old girl standing barefoot on cracked linoleum rain, soaking her hoodie, tasting blood from a slap she never deserved. That girl was gone. She was standing here now in tailored black wool and cream silk, with the power to buy and sell the hospitals that once turned her away. Later that afternoon, she sat alone in her corner office on the top floor. The city skyline spread out before her like a living map. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the distant cranes of the seaport, the cluster of glass towers around the Prudential, the lazy curve of the Charles River, catching the winter sun like a sliver of polished steel. Her office smelled of eucalyptus diffusers and fresh paper. The polished oak desk before her gleamed under the track lighting, free of clutter save for her MacBook and a single framed photo of a galaxy nebula. A gift from Min-jae with a note taped to the back perspective. Always. Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, eyes half closed. A faint ache pulsed at her temples, tension curling her shoulders forward. She reached up, massaging the tight muscle knots at the base of her skull. Her phone buzzed against the glass table. Boston Globe editorial board. Interview request. Who is E.M. Carter, the mystery CEO, reshaping healthcare? She stared at the notification for a long moment, thumb hovering over the decline button. Her reflection in the black screen stared back, calm, sharp-eyed, unflinching. Finally, she locked the phone and set it face down. She wasn't ready for them to know. Not yet. The name Whitmore carried too much rot, too much poison. The empire she was building would never be tainted by their legacy. She turned her chair slightly, gazing out at the afternoon sun as it dipped lower in the winter sky, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The city lights began to flicker on, one by one, tiny beacons against the coming dark. 12 hospitals, tens of thousands of patients served, hundreds of lives saved by PulseLink already. Investors called her the miracle child of medtech. Newspapers called her the invisible CEO, a nod to her refusal to grant interviews beyond clinical summaries or keynote addresses. But Evelyn Carter didn't need headlines. All she needed was this feeling. this quiet, simmering certainty in her bones that every floor she'd scrubbed, every slap she'd taken, every night she'd spent memorizing medical Latin while cleaning toilets, it had all led here, to a place above the city she once begged to be allowed to stay in, to a place where her name, even half hidden, made men with old money and older egos bow their heads when she entered a boardroom. As dusk descended, she rose and walked to the window, pressing her palm flat against the glass. The cold seeped into her skin, grounding her. Below the hospital's main lobby glowed warmly under recessed lights, patients and visitors moving like tiny silent actors across its pristine white floors. She closed her eyes. For a moment she let herself remember Steve's voice, dripping with contempt as he spat the word failure in her face. She let herself remember her mother's silence Daniel's laughter as he wiped spit from his chin. Then she let those memories go, because they weren't here. They weren't standing in this office looking down on a city that now bore her name. She was, and she had built it all herself. When she finally turned away from the window, the last of the sun had slipped beyond the horizon, leaving only her reflection staring back, tall, poised, unbreakable. Her lips curled into a small, satisfied smile as she reached for her phone and began drafting her next plan: expansion to New York, acquisition of CardioNet, federal contract for veterans remote monitoring. And then her fingers hovered over the screen. Her smile widened sharp and cold. And then home. The headline broke just after dawn, spreading like wildfire through Boston's finance sector before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. Whitmore & Sons Construction faces federal probe for fraud and embezzlement. Underneath the bold serif letters was a photo of Steve Whitmore, his square jaw set in grim defiance, tie askew, as he pushed past a swarm of reporters outside the courthouse steps. Behind him, Daniel trailed in a crumpled navy suit, eyes glassy with exhaustion and disbelief, one hand raised to shield his face from the camera flashes. Evelyn read the article standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, warm mug of black coffee cradled in her palms. The golden sunrise spilled across the gleaming marble floor, painting her white silk blouse in muted amber. She scrolled through the paragraphs, slowly savoring each humiliating detail: diversion of pension funds to offshore shell accounts, bribery of state inspectors to approve substandard concrete pours, failure to deliver on a $42 million public housing contract. At the bottom of the article, a single line made her lips curl into a quiet, mirthless smile. Company shares plummeted 68% overnight. Bankruptcy filing imminent. She lowered the phone, staring out over the city skyline. Below, the streets began to fill with commuters, their cars inching through traffic in shimmering metal streams. Life moved on, indifferent to the slow, inevitable collapse of men who once believed themselves untouchable. She raised the mug to her lips, inhaling the bitter steam before taking a long, deliberate sip. 3 days later, Steve sat slumped at the head of a long mahogany conference table in a private banking suite downtown. The window blinds were drawn, casting the room in a dim gray light that clung to his gaunt cheeks and lined forehead. Daniel sat beside him, tapping his bitten nails nervously against a legal pad. His designer suit looked 2 sizes too big on his rapidly thinning frame. Dark crescents pooled beneath his eyes, and a faint tremor ran through his left hand as he reached for his lukewarm coffee. Across from them sat Martin Cho, a senior partner at Atlantic East Capital. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, not a single crease breaking the smooth line of his shoulders. He tapped the edge of a thick portfolio against the table as he spoke, his voice clipped and impersonal. "You have 3 options," Martin said, sliding a glossy printed deck across the polished wood. Chapter 11. With full asset liquidation, private restructuring, with a buyout investor, or acquisition by one of the major competitors at a forced equity discount. Steve stared at the deck without seeing it. His eyes burned with shame and rage, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "We're not liquidating. We built this company. 40 years. Martin raised a single dark eyebrow. Then you need an investor. Today." Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound slicing through the tense quiet like broken glass. "Who the hell would throw money at us now? The unions are walking out, the state contracts are frozen, and our credit lines are dead. We're radioactive." Martin flipped open his portfolio with smooth, practiced movements. "There's one." Steve's eyes snapped up. "Who?" Martin's lips twitched at the corners, not quite a smile. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table, stopping it in front of Steve with a soft whisper of fine bond paper on polished wood. The letterhead gleamed under the recessed lighting. Carter Holdings, Healthcare and Infrastructure Venture Capital. E.M. Carter Martin said, tapping the name with his Mont Blanc pen. "She's been acquiring distressed clinics and hospitals across the Northeast at lightning speed. Diversified portfolio, deep private equity backing, no public shareholders to appease." Daniel frowned, scanning the page. Why would some hospital CEO care about a construction firm? "Because she's not just healthcare," Martin replied, his voice soft with reverence. "Her real strength is operational restructuring. She flips debt-ridden businesses like real estate, efficient, surgical, ruthless. They call her the financial Valkyrie. Or..." He allowed himself a small smile, finally the first hint of warmth in his corporate armor. "The goddess of medical finance." Steve swallowed, throat-bobbing with the effort. "You think she'd even look at us?" Martin shrugged lightly. "She likes high-risk salvage plays with potential for vertical integration. You built half the hospitals in this state, including 3 of hers. She might see value in controlling her own contractor supply chain." Daniel snorted, shaking his head in disbelief. "A doctor running construction firms. What kind of—" "Don't underestimate her," Martin cut in sharply. "She's not just a doctor. She's a strategist. Harvard MD, Stanford MBA, founder of PulseLink, CEO of Haven Health, 32 years old and controls $1 billion in assets. If she wants you, she'll take you. If she doesn't..." He shrugged again, spreading his manicured hands wide. "You're done." Silence fell over the table, thick and suffocating. Finally, Steve cleared his throat, his voice rough with swallowed pride. "Set the meeting." Martin inclined his head once, closing his portfolio with a decisive click. "I'll reach out today." That night, Steve sat alone in his study, nursing a half-glass of bourbon. The crystal tumbler felt heavy in his trembling fingers. The desk lamp cast a dim circle of light across a stack of unpaid invoices and final demand letters. He stared at the glowing name on his laptop screen. E.M. Carter, reading it over and over until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. A doctor. A woman. Barely older than Daniel. The idea clawed at his pride, leaving his gut twisting with bile. But beneath the rage simmered a deeper, colder fear that this was the end, and that the only lifeline left came with shackles he wouldn't be able to remove. He drained the bourbon in one long swallow, letting the burn sear a path down his throat to his churning stomach. His reflection in the darkened window looked back at him, older, thinner, weaker than he remembered. He clenched his jaw, grinding his molars until pain shot through his temples. "No," he told himself, breathing hard through his nose. "I'll fix this. I'll fix everything. She's just a doctor. I've dealt with bigger threats before." But as he sat there in the quiet, the cold certainty gnawed at him. He had never dealt with anyone like her. Across the city in her minimalist apartment overlooking the harbor, Evelyn sat at her kitchen island laptop open to a confidential dossier. The screen glowed against her tired eyes, casting sharp shadows across her cheekbones. Whitmore & Sons Construction, $62 million in debt. $14 million in public sector receivables frozen under federal investigation. $8 million in outstanding payroll liabilities. Owner Stephen Whitmore. President Daniel Whitmore. She scrolled slowly through the pages, her index finger tapping against the stainless steel countertop in a steady, thoughtful rhythm. When she reached the final page, a full list of board members, executive team, and equity holders, her lips curved into a small, cold smile. Her chest tightened, the sensation sharp and electric like lightning striking bone. She closed the laptop, gently exhaling into the silent apartment. Outside, the harbor lights flickered on in neat golden rows, illuminating the dark water in broken strips of amber. She rose and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her fingertips against the cold glass. The city lay before her, humming and alive, oblivious to the reckoning she was about to unleash. "They're coming to me," she whispered to her reflection, her voice low and trembling with something darker than triumph. "They're coming to me." Her smile widened as she turned away from the window, her silhouette sharp against the night-lit cityscape. Let the game begin. The reception lobby of Carter Holdings was silent, but for the faint strains of minimalist piano drifting from recessed ceiling speakers. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long geometric shadows across the marble floors. The security guard at the front desk barely glanced up as Steve and Daniel stepped out of the elevator, their dress shoes clicking loudly against the stone. Steve adjusted his tie for the 5th time, tugging it tighter against his sagging neck. Sweat beaded at his hairline despite the lobby's cool air conditioning. Daniel trailed behind him, shoulders slumped, his navy suit wrinkled from a sleepless night spent hunched over bankruptcy paperwork. Mr. Whitmore, the receptionist, called her tone clipped but polite. She wore a fitted black dress and a sleek headset that glinted under the recessed lights. "Ms. Carter will see you now." Steve nodded stiffly, clearing his throat. His pulse thundered against his collarbone as he followed her down the corridor. The walls were lined with abstract paintings, stark black brushstrokes against matte white canvas, and each step felt like he was walking deeper into a cathedral built of money and quiet menace. They stopped before a pair of tall, frosted glass doors. The receptionist rapped twice, then pushed them open, stepping aside with practiced deference. "Gentlemen," she murmured, "Ms. Carter." The office beyond was expansive and spare, all sharp lines and muted grays. One wall was pure glass, revealing the sweep of the city below, skyscrapers rising like jagged teeth against the pale winter sky. At the far end of the room, behind a monolithic black marble desk, sat Evelyn. She wore a white silk blouse tucked into tailored black trousers, a thin gold chain resting at the hollow of her throat. Her hair was pulled back into a low chignon, revealing the stark lines of her cheekbones. Her skin glowed under the diffuse daylight, but her eyes, dark, unblinking, were the only sign of life on her still poised face. She sat motionless in her leather chair, elbows resting lightly on the armrests, fingertips steepled before her lips as she regarded them in silence. Steve's breath caught. Something about her felt familiar. The shape of her mouth, the tilt of her chin. But before his mind could connect the frayed threads of memory, Evelyn spoke. "Please, sit." Her voice was low, velvet-wrapped steel, vibrating through the cavernous room with unassailable authority. They obeyed Daniel, collapsing into the leather chair with a quiet sob that he quickly muffled with the back of his trembling hand. Steve glanced at him in disgust before turning back to Evelyn. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice thick with forced composure. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice." Evelyn said nothing. She tilted her head slightly as if studying an insect trapped under glass. Steve cleared his throat. We've run into some temporary liquidity issues, as I'm sure your team has briefed you. But Whitmore & Sons remains a legacy construction firm with state-level contracts and decades of goodwill equity. With your capital infusion, we can restructure debt obligations and restore solvency within— "Stop!" The single word cut cleanly through his practiced pitch. He faltered mid-sentence, mouth hanging open slightly as he stared at her. Evelyn lowered her hands to her lap, folding them neatly. "Mr. Whitmore, let me clarify something before you waste any more of my time." Her voice remained calm, almost gentle, but her eyes were dark and depthless. "I am not here to listen to your proposal. You are here to listen to mine." Steve bristled, shoulders squaring, but Daniel spoke first. "Please," he rasped, his voice choked with tears. "Please, Miss Carter, we'll do anything. Our workers, they have families. We can't let them lose their homes because of us." His shoulders shook as sobs racked his frame. Tears streamed down his flushed cheeks, dripping onto the lapel of his cheap suit. Evelyn watched him cry without a flicker of emotion crossing her still face. When he fell silent, she leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing one elegant leg over the other. "My conditions are simple," she said softly. "You will sign over full equity transfer of Whitmore & Sons Construction to Carter Holdings, effective immediately." Steve stiffened. "Full equity? You will also resign your positions effective today. The entire executive board will be terminated." Daniel let out a broken sob, his forehead pressing against his trembling hands. Steve shook his head violently, sweat flying from his hairline. That's insane. You can't expect." Evelyn's gaze flicked to him sharp and final. He fell silent. She continued in the same measured tone. "You, Mr. Whitmore, will be reassigned as head of security operations at the North Haven General Site. Your duties will include night patrol perimeter checks and enforcement of visitor badge compliance." Daniel let out a strangled gasp. Steve gaped at her face, flushing deep red. "Security. You want me to stand outside with a goddamn flashlight?" Evelyn ignored him, turning her gaze to Daniel, who trembled under its weight like a man staring down a firing squad. "You," she said softly, almost tenderly, "will report as a facilities custodian at Haven Children's Hospital. Your hours will be 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., Monday through Saturday. You will mop floors, sanitize restrooms, and collect biohazard disposal bins for incineration." Daniel crumpled in his chair, sobbing so violently his shoulders shook with each ragged inhalation. "Please," he whispered through clenched teeth. "Please, I'll do anything. Just, please." "Not that." Evelyn let the silence stretch between them, only the sound of Daniel's sobs filling the cavernous room. She rested her elbow lightly on the armrest, curling her fingers against her lips in quiet contemplation. Steve was panting, chest-heaving with silent rage. You're destroying us!" She tilted her head, regarding him with that same calm, unblinking gaze. "No, Mr. Whitmore. I am giving you the chance to serve the people you stole from. For once in your life, you will earn what you take." He surged to his feet, fists clenching at his sides. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Slowly, Evelyn rose from her chair. She was smaller than him, slender and poised, but her presence filled the room with an electric, suffocating power. She stepped around the desk until she stood mere inches from him, tilting her chin up to meet his wild, panicked gaze. "Who am I?" she murmured, her voice so soft he had to strain forward to hear it. Her lips curled into a cold, beautiful smile. "I am the Reckoning." He staggered back a step as if struck. She turned away from him, moving to stand behind Daniel's hunched, trembling figure. Gently, she rested a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at her touch. "I'm not destroying you," she whispered. "I'm saving you from yourselves." Then she lifted her gaze to the silent receptionist standing in the doorway. "Prepare the contracts." The woman nodded once and disappeared. Evelyn walked back to her chair, lowering herself with measured grace. She clasped her hands on the polished marble surface, meeting Steve's stunned, empty gaze with unwavering calm. "Sign the papers by noon," she said softly. "Or watch the only thing you've ever built burn to the ground." Outside, the winter sun broke free of the grey clouds, pouring golden light through the vast glass windows, illuminating Evelyn where she sat, calm, poised, unbreakable. Steve sank slowly back into his chair, shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of defeat. And across from him, Evelyn Carter smiled faintly, her dark eyes glittering with something deeper than triumph. Justice. The lights of Boston flickered below her window like dying embers in a vast, silent hearth. Evelyn sat cross-legged on the cold marble floor of her apartment, a single lamp casting a soft, golden glow around her. Shadows clung to the edges of the room, long and unmoving like silent witnesses to what she was about to do. She wore an oversized gray sweatshirt, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her dark hair pulled into a loose, messy bun at the nape of her neck. Her bare feet were tucked beneath her toenails painted a chipped navy blue. In front of her lay a small black lockbox, its steel corners worn from years of travel, years of being hidden behind cleaning supplies, under floorboards, behind stacks of tax documents, everywhere and nowhere carried like a silent wound. Her fingers trembled slightly as she entered the combination. The lock clicked open with a dull metallic snap, loud in the stillness of her apartment. She drew in a shaky breath and lifted the lid. Inside lay a handful of old photos bound together with a thin fraying piece of red string. Underneath them a folded piece of paper, brittle yellowing the creases nearly worn through, and a child's hair tie faded pink with a tiny plastic butterfly clinging stubbornly to its elastic loop. She reached for the photos first, her fingertips brushing the cool, glossy surface. She untied the string slowly, methodically, as if performing a sacred ritual. The top photo showed her at 8 years old, wearing a floral cotton dress that hung off her thin shoulders, her hair tied in 2 neat pigtails. She was smiling, but her eyes were too large for her face, too solemn for a child. Behind her, Steve loomed, his hand resting on her small shoulder, his grip visibly tight. Even in the faded photograph, her skin around his fingers was blanched white. Evelyn's chest tightened. She flipped to the next photo, then the next, each image unraveling the thin stitches she had sewn around these memories to keep herself whole. Then she came to the last photo. She drew in a ragged breath, pressing her fist hard against her mouth to keep the sob from tearing free. It showed her tied to the dining room chair wrists, bound with coarse yellow rope that dug deep into her skin. Her face was turned away from the camera, revealing only the dark stain of blood that ran from her temple to her jaw, dripping onto the thin cotton of her pajama collar. The skin along her cheekbone was swollen and purple, her lip split open. She remembered the cold burn of the oak floor against her knees, the way the rope fibers dug into her wrists until she felt blood soaking the strands. She remembered the taste of copper and salt, the way her tears mixed with the blood in her mouth, and the distant sound of the television blaring a football game in the living room, while Steve screamed about her ungratefulness, her uselessness, her existence being a debt he regretted paying. She remembered thinking she would die that night. She remembered hoping she would. Evelyn pressed the photograph to her chest, curling over it like a grieving animal. Her hair fell in dark curtains around her face, hiding the silent tears streaming down her cheeks, soaking the black cotton of her leggings. Minutes passed, the only sound in the room, her ragged breathing and the faint hum of the city far below. Finally she sat up, wiping her tears with trembling fingers. Her eyes were red and swollen, but they burned with a fierce, clear light as she set the photo on the floor in front of her. She reached into the lockbox again and drew out the folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing childish handwriting in uneven pencil strokes. "When I grow up, I will be strong. I will make sure no one ever hurts me again." She remembered writing it at 10 years old, the day after Steve shoved her against the kitchen counter so hard she vomited from the pain. She had hidden it under her mattress for years, reading it to herself at night like a prayer. When she left home, she carried it with her folded into the pocket of her jeans, a vow pressed against her skin like a brand. She laid the note beside the photo and leaned back against the cool glass of the window. The city below blurred behind her tears. She let them fall freely now, no longer fighting the grief coiling in her chest, like smoke in a sealed room. After a long while she drew in a deep, trembling breath and picked up the photo again. Her fingers traced the outline of her swollen cheek, the dark bruise beneath her eye, the thin arms bound against the wooden chair. "Look at you," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Look at what he did to you." The apartment felt impossibly silent around her, the weight of memory pressing against her ribs, until she could barely draw breath. Outside, the harbor lights flickered in the distance, casting broken golden lines across the dark water. She pressed the photo against her forehead, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry it took so long." She lowered the photo to her lap and wiped her tears with the back of her trembling hand. Her gaze sharpened, focusing on the girl staring back at her from 20 years in the past. "But tomorrow," she murmured, her voice softening into something almost tender, almost maternal. "Tomorrow you won't ever have to be afraid of him again." Her words drifted into the quiet like a promise carried on smoke. She set the photo down, gently smoothing its crumpled edges with reverent fingers. Then she closed the lockbox, snapping the latch shut with quiet finality, and stood slowly, her knees aching from the cold marble. She walked to her bathroom and washed her face in silence, watching the water swirl pink down the drain. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror, dark eyes ringed with grief and resolve, hair falling in damp strands against her flushed cheeks. She didn't look away. Tomorrow she would walk into that boardroom in her tailored white suit, hair pulled back in a tight chignon, eyes dark and clear, voice steady as stone, steady as... Tomorrow she would end this. She turned off the bathroom light, plunging the apartment into darkness, and walked to her bedroom. As she slipped beneath the crisp linen sheets, her hand brushed against her phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up, illuminating her tired face in the silent room. Board meeting, 8:30 a.m., contract finalization. She pressed the phone to her chest, closing her eyes against the tears that burned behind her eyelids. Tomorrow, she whispered into the darkness voice, shaking with grief and triumph. Tomorrow he will remember my name. Outside, the city slept, unaware that in a penthouse overlooking the dark harbor, a reckoning had been forged from blood and silence, and it would rise with the dawn. The clock on the conference room wall ticked past 11:42 p.m., the second hand slicing through the sterile silence with mechanical precision. Outside, the city was asleep under a blanket of winter fog, streetlights casting diffuse golden orbs across the deserted avenues below. Inside, under the harsh fluorescence of recessed ceiling fixtures, Evelyn sat at the head of a long obsidian table. Her tailored white blazer gleamed under the lights, the crisp silk blouse beneath it perfectly pressed. Her hair was pinned into a sleek, low bun, a single diamond stud glinting in each ear. She was still poised, utterly silent, as her dark eyes watched Steve's trembling hand drag the Mont Blanc pen across the signature line. He sat hunched in the leather chair, sweat beading along his hairline, dripping down into the creased collar of his once expensive dress shirt. His tie was loosened, top button undone, as if the fabric itself threatened to choke him. Each letter of his name seemed to cost him a pound of flesh, the pen scraping audibly against the thick contract paper in the dead quiet of the room. Beside him, Daniel sat with his elbows on his knees, head bowed, shoulders quaking with silent sobs. His expensive suit jacket was discarded over the chair behind him, wrinkled and forgotten. His hands trembled as he wiped his streaming nose with a crumpled tissue. When Steve finally dropped the pen, it clattered onto the contract with a sharp metallic echo. He exhaled shakily, staring down at the document. Equity Transfer Agreement, Whitmore and Sons Construction to Carter Holdings, Inc. His signature glistened wetly beneath the final clause, the ink still drying. Evelyn didn't move. She studied his bowed head for a long moment, her gaze cold and unreadable. Then, without a word, she reached into the slim black leather folder beside her and withdrew a small photograph. She placed it face down on the table and slid it across the polished surface with 2 fingers. The photo skidded to a stop directly in front of Steve. The fluorescent light above flickered softly, illuminating the worn, frayed edges of the glossy print. "Look at it," she said quietly, her voice low and steady, vibrating with restrained power. Steve frowned confused and reached out with a trembling hand. He flipped the photo over. For a moment he didn't understand what he was seeing. The image showed a young girl no more than 8 or 9 tied to a wooden chair with coarse yellow rope. Her hair was tangled across her swollen face, one eye nearly swollen shut, blood dripping from a split in her bottom lip onto the thin cotton of her pajama collar. The bruises bloomed purple and black across her thin arms where they were bound to the chair. His breath caught in his throat, the sound strangled and wet. His eyes darted from the photo to Evelyn, back to the photo, then back to her again. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her gaze locked on his face, watching every flicker of dawning horror bleed through his carefully maintained mask of stoic dignity. "Do you recognize her?" she asked, her tone so soft it was almost tender. Almost. Steve's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes welled with tears that trembled along his lower lashes before spilling down his lined cheeks. His chest began to heave with shallow, ragged breaths, the fabric of his shirt straining over his broad shoulders as sobs built in his throat. Daniel lifted his head, eyes bloodshot and glassy. He frowned in confusion, leaning forward to peer at the photo. When he saw it, his mouth fell open, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His gaze darted to Evelyn, and for the first time that night, true fear flickered across his face. Steve's hands shook violently as he reached for the photo, his fingertips brushing the glossy surface with a trembling reverence as if it might burn him. Tears streamed down his face, now dripping onto the table in slow, heavy drops. "Evelyn," he choked, his voice breaking on her name for the first time in decades. I didn't know. I didn't." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him with dark, fathomless eyes. "Didn't know what?" she asked softly. "Didn't know you were beating a child. Didn't know you were leaving her tied to a chair for hours while you drank beer and watched football. Didn't know you were breaking her ribs when you kicked her down the stairs for dropping your coffee mug." Each word sliced through the room like a scalpel, clean and lethal. Steve flinched with every sentence, his sobs breaking free, now loud and ragged and ugly. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know." "You knew," she interrupted quietly, her voice flat and unyielding. "You always knew." Steve's sobs shook his entire frame now. He pushed back his chair abruptly, the metal legs screeching across the polished floor, and fell to his knees before her. His hands reached out, grasping at the hem of her white trousers, clutching the smooth fabric with desperate, trembling fingers. "Please," he whispered through broken sobs. "Please, Evelyn. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please." His tears fell onto her polished black leather heels, streaking the gleaming surface with translucent salt trails. His forehead pressed against her shin as he wept, his broad shoulders shaking with each ragged inhale. Evelyn stared down at him in silence, her face utterly still, dark eyes unreadable. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting stark shadows across the tableau. The broken old man kneeling at her feet, his sobs echoing in the silent boardroom, and the woman standing above him calm and immovable as a marble statue. Slowly she reached down and pried his trembling fingers from her trousers one by one. His grip resisted at first, clinging to her as if she were the only thing tethering him to this earth. But her hands were strong and unyielding, and finally his fingers fell away, dropping to his lap like dead leaves. She stepped back, his tears leaving faint, wet streaks against the crisp white fabric. He remained kneeling, forehead pressed to the floor, now sobbing into the polished marble. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, watching his father crumble before the woman they once called worthless. His own tears flowed silently down his cheeks, dripping onto his wrinkled dress shirt, as his shoulders caved inward, as if trying to make himself small enough to disappear. Evelyn reached down and picked up the photograph, slipping it back into the slim leather folder with quiet precision. She snapped it shut and tucked it under her arm. Her gaze swept over Steve's trembling form, then flicked to Daniel's tear-streaked face. "Tomorrow morning," she said softly, her voice as calm as moonlight on black water, "you will both report to your new assignments." Steve sobbed harder, his cries echoing off the sterile glass walls, each one punctuated by the mechanical tick of the clock above the door. Evelyn turned away without another word and walked towards the exit, her black heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, each step ringing with quiet, merciless finality. As she reached the doorway, she paused and turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting Steve's tear-blurred gaze one last time. "Sleep well," she murmured. "Your reckoning has only just begun." Then she stepped through the door and disappeared into the silent, waiting darkness beyond. The boardroom door swung shut behind Evelyn with a soft hydraulic hiss. The corridor beyond was silent, the muted hum of recessed lighting casting her long shadow across the polished black marble floor. She walked with measured, unhurried steps, the echo of her heels trailing behind her like a metronome ticking off the final seconds of an execution. Inside, Daniel sat frozen in his chair, staring at the empty doorway with wide, glassy eyes. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, his fingers clenching the arms of his chair so tightly the leather creaked under his grip. Steve remained on his knees, forehead pressed to the cold floor, sobbing softly, his shoulders shuddering with each broken exhale. Suddenly the silence fractured. Daniel exploded out of his chair, the metal legs screeching against the marble as it toppled backward. The force of his movement sent it skidding across the room until it crashed against the glass wall with a hollow, ringing thud. He lunged for the door muscles, coiled with rage and desperation, his polished dress shoes squeaking against the floor as he tore down the hallway after her. "Evelyn," he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "Get back here!" His footsteps thundered down the corridor, each one a gunshot echo against the sterile walls. As he rounded the corner, he saw her, walking away from him calm and unhurried, her white blazer glowing under the recessed lights like an unearthly beacon. Something inside him snapped. "You ruined us!" he roared, his voice reverberating off the glass and steel. "You think you can do this to me, to us? I'll kill you! You hear me? I'll fucking kill you!" His scream tore through the silent executive floor like a blade through silk. Office doors cracked open along the hallway as staff peeked out, eyes wide with alarm, frozen in place by the raw violence vibrating from his words. Evelyn didn't turn. She kept walking, her heels clicking steadily, her hair swaying softly against the crisp collar of her white blazer. Daniel's vision tunneled rage, flooding every cell in his body until all he could see was her retreating figure. His heart hammered against his ribs, saliva pooling at the corners of his mouth as he screamed again. "You're dead, bitch!" He charged down the hall, arms outstretched, fingers curled into claws. His shadow warped across the marble floor, lunging ahead of him like a monster unchained. 10 feet, 5 feet. 1. Suddenly a blur of black moved from the periphery. The head of security intercepted him mid-charge, slamming his thick forearm across Daniel's chest with brutal efficiency. The force knocked the air from Daniel's lungs in a sharp, wet gasp as his momentum folded him backward against the man's armored bulk. Daniel thrashed wildly, spittle flying from his lips, his face twisted in primal rage. The veins in his neck stood out like ropes as he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let me go, I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll fucking kill her." The security guard tightened his grip, his biceps bulging beneath his suit jacket as he pinned Daniel's arms to his sides and jerked him backward away from Evelyn's silent, steady figure. 2 more guards arrived, one seizing Daniel's flailing legs, the other wrapping an iron arm around his throat in a textbook rear restraint hold. Together they forced him down onto his knees, his shoes skidding against the polished floor as he struggled, sweat dripping from his hairline onto the marble below. Evelyn stopped walking. She turned slowly, pivoting on one sharp heel until she faced him fully. Her dark eyes flicked over his kneeling, trembling form, her gaze unreadable. Daniel met her stare, his chest heaving with ragged, sobbing breaths. His hair clung to his damp forehead, eyes wild and red with fury and something deeper, something like terror. "Please," he spat, his voice cracking as tears mixed with saliva on his chin. "Please don't do this. Don't do this to us." The guards held him firm, his knees pressed into the cold marble, his expensive suit trousers gathering damp stains where they touched the freshly polished floor. Evelyn's expression remained utterly still. Her gaze was sharp as glass, dark as storm water, ancient in its silence. She took one slow step forward, then another, until she stood directly before him. The fluorescent light above caught in the silver pins of her hair, casting a halo around her head that made her look almost inhuman. For a moment, she simply looked down at him, silent, her eyes fathomless. The corridor around them buzzed with hushed whispers as staff watched from doorways, clutching phones to their chests, unsure whether to call security or simply bear witness. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and calm, vibrating with something older than rage and sharper than hatred. 10 years ago, she murmured her words soft but carrying down the silent hall. "I begged you to stop." Daniel froze. His breath hitched sharply, his pupils contracting as her words sliced through his fog of rage. Her lips curved into a small, cold smile, though her eyes remained as still and dark as a dead ocean. "I remember every word I said to you that night." She continued, her voice almost tender now, like a mother soothing a crying child. "I remember how my voice cracked when I begged you to stop hitting me, to stop spitting on me, to stop laughing while you called me worthless." Tears spilled freely down Daniel's cheeks, now hot and silent. His shoulders sagged, his body convulsing with each shuddering sob that racked his chest. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying his ruined, trembling form with a gaze as cold and distant as the winter stars outside the windows. "But today," she whispered, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a soft, lethal murmur only he could hear today, "I don't need to beg you for anything." Her words cut through him like a scalpel, clean and deep. His sobs broke into jagged, broken sounds as he shook under the guard's iron grip. Evelyn straightened, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the sleeve of her blazer. She turned away from him without another word, her heels clicking decisively against the marble as she walked down the corridor, the fluorescent lights gleaming against the pristine white of her suit. Behind her, Daniel collapsed fully onto the floor, his forehead pressing into the cold marble as sobs tore from his chest in violent, convulsive waves. The guards stepped back, releasing their hold. One reached down and pressed a hand to Daniel's trembling shoulder in silent warning. But he didn't move. He only wept, his cries echoing down the long, silent hallway, like the dying wails of a wounded animal. Evelyn didn't look back. She walked calmly to the private elevator at the end of the corridor, her reflection sharp and brilliant in the polished steel doors. As the elevator chimed softly and the doors slid open, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the executive helipad. The doors closed on her silent, poised figure. and in the vast, silent hallway behind her, Daniel's sobs continued echoing against glass and marble like a requiem for a kingdom burned to ash. The news broke before dawn, flooding every financial feed and local headline before the city's morning coffee shops even opened their doors. Medical finance goddess E.M. Carter rescues Whitmore & Sons construction from collapse. The Boston Herald ran it as a front-page banner. Their online article featured a crisp editorial photo of Evelyn stepping out of Carter Holdings headquarters in her signature white blazer and black slacks, chin tilted up, hair slicked into a smooth chignon. The caption read, "Carter's empire expands into construction with unprecedented bailout acquisition." Analysts hail her as the savior of hundreds of union jobs and state contracts. Cable business channels looped B-roll footage of Whitmore construction sites alongside panel commentary praising Evelyn's visionary cross-industry strategy. Her name trended on social media by 7 a.m., praised as a symbol of modern female power. But they didn't know the truth. Behind the headlines, behind the glossy PR statements drafted by her in-house counsel overnight, a quieter current ran through Boston's legal community that morning, one that pulsed not with admiration but with dread. In a glass-walled conference room on the 54th floor of the State Financial Crimes Bureau, 2 senior federal agents sat hunched over a thick case file marked Whitmore Investigation, Active. The lead agent, a stern black woman named Special Agent Rhonda Bell, tapped her manicured nail against the page, showing a forensic audit table. 52 shell entities all routing union pension funds into private offshore accounts. Cayman, St. Kitts, Singapore. Her partner, a wiry older man with wire-rimmed glasses, whistled softly. Steve Whitmore's been embezzling from his own workers' pensions for 15 years? 17, Bell replied curtly. He moved fast in the early years, then got greedy. She flipped to the next page, a high-resolution arrest warrant request draft. Steve's mugshot placeholder stared up at her lined face, twisted in mid-speech, eyes half closed. Belle leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her tailored navy blazer. Her gold badge clipped to her belt glinted under the fluorescent lights as she exhaled sharply. Asset forfeitures in process. Once Carter Holdings finalizes the acquisition paperwork today, we move in. Her partner frowned. You think Carter knew about all this when she negotiated the buyout? Belle arched a brow. She's E.M. Carter. She knows everything. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet broken only by the hum of the overhead HVAC. Finally, Belle closed the file with a decisive snap. Call the marshals. Tell them we want Whitmore booked by lunch. At 9:13 a.m., Steve walked through the marble lobby of Carter Holdings for what would be the last time as a free man. He wore his new security uniform, black tactical slacks, and a navy polo shirt with the Carter Holdings crest embroidered in gold thread over his left breast. The radio clipped to his belt crackled softly with dispatcher chatter as he adjusted the stiff canvas belt around his thick waist. His old Rolex no longer graced his wrist. He had pawned it 2 days prior to pay a private investigator hoping for leverage on Evelyn to renegotiate his humiliating employment reassignment. The investigator had found nothing. As he approached the front security desk to clock in, the sliding glass doors behind him whooshed open with a low mechanical sigh. Stephen Whitmore, a deep voice called out. He turned, frowning, just as 2 federal marshals in dark windbreakers approached, their gold badges glinting under the lobby's recessed lights. Mr. Whitmore, the taller agent said calmly, hand resting on his hip over a holstered Glock. You're under arrest for wire fraud, pension embezzlement, and violation of the Taft-Hartley Act. Steve's mouth fell open. What are you? Turn around, hands behind your back. For a moment, he stood frozen. The lobby's morning foot traffic slowed, dozens of Carter Holdings employees pausing mid-stride to stare. Phones slipped quietly from handbags as staff filmed the unfolding scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then the shorter marshal stepped forward, grasped Steve's wrist, and twisted his arms firmly behind his back. Cold steel cuffs clicked tight around his thick wrists. Steve gasped, chest heaving with panic. "Wait, you can't. I have a meeting." The taller marshal leaned close, his voice low and calm. "You have the right to remain silent." The words blurred into a dull roar in Steve's ears as they guided him past the reception desk, past the silent security staff who stared with wide eyes past the Carter Holdings brass plaque mounted to the black marble wall. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Steve squinted against the morning sun. Cameras flashed in a blinding barrage as reporters surged forward, microphones thrust past the marshal's shoulders. "Mr. Whitmore, did you steal pension funds from your own workers? Is it true you used union money for offshore investments? Do you have any comment for your employees who lost their retirements?" His knees buckled, and for a moment he thought he might collapse onto the cold concrete. But the agents tightened their grip, half dragging him to the waiting black SUV idling at the curb. As they forced him into the back seat, he caught one last glimpse of the towering glass building behind them. On the 50th floor, through tinted windows, he imagined he saw a silhouette, slender, unmoving, watching him fall. At the same hour, Daniel sat in a cramped IRS substation interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights turning his tear-streaked face sallow and sickly. Across from him, a young tax fraud investigator flipped through his company's quarterly filings, with a pen tapping in rhythmic, unforgiving ticks against the metal table. Overstated charitable deductions, underreported contract revenues, off-the-books labor payments the agent recited in a bored monotone. "Mr. Whitmore, we're looking at anywhere between 5 and 15 years. Daniel's hands shook where they rested on his knees. The cuffs binding his wrists to the metal chair rattled softly with each tremor. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My dad handled taxes. I just signed where he told me to." The investigator arched a brow, unimpressed. "Ignorance isn't a defense, sir. You knowingly signed fraudulent tax returns. You also personally expensed a $28,000 custom sound system as construction safety equipment." Daniel's lips parted, but no words came out. Tears welled again in his bloodshot eyes, slipping silently down his gaunt cheeks. He lowered his head, shoulders shaking with silent, broken sobs. Across town, Evelyn stood before a floor-to-ceiling window in her minimalist apartment, sipping espresso from a delicate glass mug. The morning sun poured over her crisp white blouse and black slacks, catching in the diamond studs at her ears. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop beside her. She glanced at it, her dark eyes flicking across the preview notification. Subject: Whitmore arrest. Pension embezzlement charges. Filed. Another buzz. Subject: Daniel Whitmore. IRS fraud investigation confirmed. She set down the mug, slowly pressing her fingertips against the cool glass window as she stared down at the waking city below. The streets hummed with buses and taxis, pedestrians huddled in coats against the winter chill, the river glittering faintly beyond the skyscrapers like a steel ribbon under morning light. She felt no joy, no vindication, only a quiet, echoing finality in her chest like a bell rung in a cathedral long abandoned. They were falling, yes, but she was not rising from their ashes. She had already been forged in them, and now, at last, she was free. The winter wind cut through the rows of silent headstones, rattling the brittle brown grass underfoot. Gray clouds loomed heavy overhead, diffusing the morning light into a muted pewter glow that cast no shadows. The graveyard was empty, save for the distant drone of traffic from the city below, and the occasional caw of a lone blackbird perched on a marble angel. Evelyn stood before a small headstone near the northern fence line, her white wool coat fluttering around her calves. A thin veil of frost clung to the carved letters. Margaret Ann Carter, Whitmore, beloved wife and mother, 1959, 2015. She kneeled slowly, careful not to crush the delicate white peonies bundled in craft paper in her gloved hands. Her breath rose in soft white clouds as she brushed away a curl of dead grass that had blown against the stone's base. For a long time she said nothing. The wind tugged strands of dark hair loose from her low bun, sweeping them across her cold, reddened cheek. Her eyes were dark and clear, gazing at the engraved name with an expression caught somewhere between grief and finality. "I thought I'd feel different," she murmured, her voice almost lost to the restless wind. "Standing here, after everything." She traced the letters of her mother's name with her gloved fingertips, feeling the sharp edges of each carved vowel bite against the thin leather. Her chest tightened as a flicker of memory rose unbidden. Her mother's hands slender and trembling, buttoning her coat on cold mornings before school. The scent of lavender soap on her skin. The soft hum of lullabies whispered in the darkness of Evelyn's childhood bedroom. Then other memories followed. The slaps that landed but never left marks. The silence at the dinner table as Steve screamed. The way her mother's eyes had gone glassy and far away as Evelyn cried on the kitchen floor, clutching her bleeding scalp. Evelyn swallowed hard, feeling her throat burn with the grief she thought she'd left behind. "I understand why you stayed," she whispered. "Why you said nothing. Why you pretended it wasn't happening." A single tear slipped down her cheek, hot against the winter-chilled skin. She let it fall onto the frost-bitten grass. "I forgive you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I forgive you for not saving me." She set the bundle of white peonies at the base of the headstone, gently straightening the stems so they lay in neat, graceful lines against the granite. "But I will never forget." She rose slowly, brushing the frost from her knees. Her gaze lingered on the grave for a moment longer. Dark eyes deep with something that was not quite love, not quite hatred, but something older, sadder, more enduring. Then she turned and walked away, her boots crunching softly over the frozen grass, leaving only the pale flowers behind, as silent witnesses to her vow. The orphanage sat at the edge of Dorchester, a squat red brick building with peeling white trim and a sagging front porch. The chain-link fence surrounding the small gravel yard rattled softly in the winter wind, its metal joints clinking like distant chimes. Inside, the air smelled of old radiators and lemon floor polish. Children's voices rose and fell in chaotic waves from the small dining hall, punctuated by giggles and the clatter of plastic cups against formica tabletops. Evelyn stood near the entryway, speaking quietly with Sister Agnes, a plump woman with wiry gray hair tucked into a loose bun under her navy cardigan. "They don't know you're here yet," Sister Agnes said, her eyes warm and crinkled at the corners. "I thought it best to keep it a surprise." Evelyn smiled faintly, nodding. "Thank you, sister." The older woman studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes sweeping over Evelyn's tailored black trousers and cream silk blouse, the slim gold watch at her wrist, the small diamond studs gleaming against her dark hair. "You look tired, dear," she said softly, resting a wrinkled hand against Evelyn's forearm. "But lighter somehow, like something's been lifted." Evelyn hesitated, feeling her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She swallowed hard before answering. "It has." Sister Agnes patted her arm gently, then turned and gestured for her to follow. They walked down a narrow hallway, lined with faded watercolor paintings taped to the cream-painted cinderblock walls. Children's voices grew louder as they approached the dining hall, the smell of macaroni and canned peas wafting through the open doorway. Sister Agnes stepped inside, clapping her hands twice. The chatter fell into a hush as 20 pairs of wide, curious eyes turned to her. "Girls," she said, her voice warm but firm, "we have a very special visitor today." The girls, ranging in age from 5 to 13, sat in 2 neat rows at the long plastic tables, each wearing second-hand sweaters and thrifted jeans. Their eyes were bright and eager despite the exhaustion etched into the soft skin beneath them. Evelyn stepped forward, her black heels clicking softly against the scratched linoleum. For a moment she stood silently taking them in, their small shoulders, their uneven ponytails, the mismatched shoes on their feet. She felt something shift in her chest, a quiet breaking that wasn't pain, but something gentler, something like healing. "Hello," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Evelyn." One of the older girls raised her hand tentatively, her dark hair pulled back into a fraying blue scrunchie. Are you the doctor from the TV?" she asked, her voice small and awed. Evelyn smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am." A ripple of whispers ran through the room, small hands covering mouths, wide eyes darting between her and Sister Agnes. She stepped forward, pulling a slim folder from her leather tote. She set it on the end of the table and flipped it open, revealing 2 neat stacks of official paperwork. "I'm here today," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "because I want you to know that your future is yours to build, that no one has the right to tell you what you're worth." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the small sea of upturned faces, each pair of eyes shimmering with quiet hope. "These," she said, gesturing to the papers, "are full scholarships. 20 of them. For each of you. Full tuition to any private secondary school in Massachusetts. Uniforms, supplies, meals, transportation. Everything covered." The silence was absolute. Then a small gasp broke the stillness, followed by a quiet sob. The girl with the fraying blue scrunchie clapped her hands over her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Really," she whispered. "All of us." Evelyn's own eyes burned with tears she did not let fall. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you." The room erupted into quiet, shaky cheers. Some of the girls clung to each other, crying softly into worn cotton sleeves. Others sat in stunned silence, small hands pressed to their chests as if to keep their hearts from bursting. Evelyn watched them, her chest tightening with an ache that was both grief and joy. Sister Agnes moved forward, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. She reached for Evelyn's hands, squeezing them tightly. "God bless you, child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "God bless you." Evelyn smiled through the tears brimming in her dark eyes. She turned back to the girls, her voice soft and certain as she spoke. "You are not what has happened to you," she said, her words trembling with the force of truth. "You are what you choose to become." Outside, the winter sun broke through the thick gray clouds, spilling golden light across the orphanage windows. And inside, 20 girls sat bathed in its glow, their tear-streaked faces alight with hope, their eyes reflecting a future no one could ever again steal from them. The late afternoon sun poured down over Boston like molten gold, illuminating every glass tower and iron bridge in radiant light. The city buzzed with Friday rush-hour traffic weaving through the maze of streets as commuters hurried home to dinner tables and quiet apartments. Outside the flagship hospital of Evelyn Carter Medical Group, reporters clustered near the entrance awning, their camera lenses glinting under the sun like a wall of watchful eyes. Patients in wheelchairs sat along the wide front plaza, soaking in the last warmth of the day, as nurses wheeled IV poles alongside them. Above them rose the hospital's sleek steel and glass facade, each window tinted a warm amber under the descending sun. The automatic glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Evelyn stepped out. She wore a tailored white blazer over a black silk blouse, the hem of her blazer rippling softly around her thighs in the breeze. The late sun caught in her dark hair, pinned into a sleek, low bun, making it gleam like polished obsidian. Diamond studs flashed at her ears. A slim rose-gold watch peeked from beneath her left cuff. For a moment she paused at the top of the wide granite steps, her dark eyes scanning the bustling plaza below. The breeze lifted a few strands of hair across her cheek. She reached up and tucked them behind her ear with graceful precision, her movement calm and unhurried. The gold hospital logo behind her glowed under the sun. Evelyn Carter, Medical Group, where hope is reborn. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sunlight warm her eyelids. For a fleeting second, the sounds of the city melted away, replaced by the memory of rain drumming against a rotting roof, the creak of a leather belt being unbuckled, the echo of her own childhood sobs swallowed by an empty kitchen. But the memory held no power over her now. She opened her eyes again, dark and clear, focused only on the horizon beyond the gleaming towers of Boston. A faint smile tugged at her lips, not warm, not bitter, simply resolute. From behind her, a young nurse rushed out, her badge swinging on its lanyard. "Dr. Carter," she called breathlessly. "Your car is waiting at the curb." Evelyn didn't turn immediately. She stood still, breathing in the scent of antiseptic and blooming city maples drifting on the late spring breeze. Finally, she glanced over her shoulder, her dark eyes catching the nurse's anxious gaze. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was low and calm, edged with quiet command that needed no force to be obeyed. She descended the granite steps one by one, her black heels clicking in clean, rhythmic beats against the stone. As she reached the bottom, a gust of warm wind swept across the plaza, lifting the hem of her blazer in a gentle, fluttering arc around her legs. She paused there, silhouetted in radiant gold light, the towering hospital rising behind her like a cathedral. She tilted her chin up, feeling the sun on her skin. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her faint smile curling with an edge of something sharper, something unbreakable. In her mind, her voice whispered quiet and certain, "I didn't do this to take revenge. I did this to teach them a lesson about justice." A line of medical residents stood near the valet lane, white coats fluttering in the breeze as they whispered to each other behind clipboard stacks. One young intern stared openly, clutching his pen to his chest, as if he might drop it from awe. To them, she was a legend, a name spoken in quiet cafeteria corners, as a prayer for ambition, a reminder of what a woman could build when no one believed in her. But to her they were hope, the hope she never had, the hope she had sworn to build for others. She walked towards the black town car idling by the curb. The driver, a young Haitian man in a crisp gray suit, jumped out to open the back door, bowing his head slightly. "Good evening, Dr. Carter," he murmured with quiet reverence. She paused beside him, her gaze drifting to the reflection in the car's tinted windows. The woman staring back at her wore tailored white wool and silent power like a second skin. Her face was calm, lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. But in her dark eyes beneath the unbreakable steel flickered a small, quiet ember of something older. Grief, perhaps, or forgiveness, or the ashes of both. She exhaled softly, fogging the tinted window with her breath. The glass dulled her reflection for a moment, transforming her sharp edges into something softer, almost ethereal. Then she spoke, her voice low and certain, vibrating with quiet finality. "Never again." She lowered her gaze, her faint smile widening into something almost peaceful. Then she stepped into the car, her white blazer catching the last blaze of sunset as she disappeared into its quiet, leather-scented interior. The driver closed the door with a gentle thud and circled to the front seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, the hospital logo gleamed in the golden light behind them, each engraved letter blazing with silent, unwavering power. Evelyn Carter, Medical Group, where hope is reborn. The camera panned up, rising slowly past the hospital's glowing windows, past the helipad lights blinking on as evening settled past the city's sprawling glass towers now lit in pale lavender and gold. And as the screen faded to black, Evelyn's final whispered words echoed softly into the darkness. "This isn't revenge. This is justice. Fade out."